I'm Stephen Schmidt from the Greenwich Library. My guest today is the writer Joanne McNeil. Her book, Lurking, How a Person Became a User, came out in late February and is published by MCD Books. Joanne, thank you so much for taking some time out to chat with me, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Just to get us started, could you give us a little rundown about the book?
The book is looking at the past 30 years of communities and identities on the internet. So that would be various platforms and services starting around 1990. It was a lot of dial-up services, BBSs, things called conferencing services. Then 10 years later, a look at the early social networks like Friendster and MySpace. And then the final kind of decade that I look at, that would be about the time of the iPhone, smartphones, apps, and the omnipresence of internet technology.
So regarding the title of your book, I was always under the assumption that the term lurking was a pejorative, something sinister, but you have a different definition for it in your book. Can you explain what you mean by the term?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the three lines of the book is the title Lurking, and the practice of lurking, which is looking and witnessing as opposed to necessarily being deeply involved in a community or interacting as of yet. So with a case of, say, an early message board, you might have wanted to read a bunch of the posts before you started joining in the community, or even maybe you were reading posts that for communities that you wouldn't necessarily want to take part in. That sense of invisibility of a user, there are a lot of complications because you might be invisible to other users, but you're definitely not invisible to the internet technology, which is analytics and tracking. But it's also very unique to the experience, and I think a lot of people who post on the internet now know that there are probably people reading this, even if I can't see them. So that's just that sense of like almost performing a little bit that comes through.
So you were pretty critical of social media developers in the book. I'm wondering why, and also, can you explain the difference between what most developers want and what most users want when it comes to social communities and social media?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is in the book, I really wanted people to think clearly about what a user is in contrast with the founders and developers of the platforms that they use. And in a lot of the early examples I give, the people who worked on these communities, because they were so small, they were also part of the community. So they would be at the meetups. They had like an element of accountability to the communities that formed because they were participants themselves, because they might see them face to face, they would see them socially, and also they wanted to have a good experience themselves. But as platforms started to become consolidated, when it became no longer a case of here's one service for this niche interest, but here is one service that delivers many different opportunities for different communities, like something like Facebook, which is, I think it's something like 2 billion users. When you have something like that, that sense of accountability to the users is so strained. And that also means that the opportunity to make changes that would be harmful to users, that they can do that much more indirectly and without the accountability. So I think one thing that I really wanted to make that clear right from the beginning, one reason I wanted to make that clear right from the beginning, is that I hear a lot of people say, I hate the word user. And I think like Yeah, it's not a great word, but I mean, what do you hate about the word user? Do you hate thinking of yourself as somewhat powerless in contrast with someone who is developing the service or founding a service? Or is it because that difference between the roles that people take, it's very important to think about your own agency as a user. And I wouldn't say it's like a great word, but it's very important to know your role in the platform and the lack of agency that you have as a user.
Speaking of the term user, in regarding social media, when does a user become a laborer, often an unpaid laborer?
If you look right from the beginning, what Google built their search technology on is actually the work of users, and it's a little tricky to explain. So I'm going to try to do this as best I can. But early search engines, the way that they would work is you would just plug in information, and the search engines would match based on the words you entered. The way that Google worked, this would be like early 90s, and this is why people really liked Google, was because they didn't just look for the word matching, they looked for the word on a link, because that meant someone else had created a link on a web page that, say, I'm trying to, an example that I give in the book would be, say you have someone who's looking for information about the Museum of Modern Art. And if they had used an ordinary search engine, they might have seen results that were not relevant in terms of maybe it was a fan page for museums in general, or maybe it was a t-shirt company that had a t-shirt that's a Museum of Modern Art on it. But what Google would do is it would look for actual links, like someone put on their page a link to another page that said the words Museum of Modern Art. And the thing that suggests is that someone is directing you to information, so that their local knowledge that, okay, I'm giving you a link and I'm using the words to describe it as Museum of Modern Art, that's where I'm sending people coming to my page there. So Google would scrape that, and that's how it would determine the score of the relevancy of the information. So it's really, really clever, and that's why people, like, when Google came around, it was just incredible how relevant the scores would be when you would search for information. But the thing I wanted people to think about is that's building a company on top of decisions that users have made. And on top of that, like, we see this with a lot of companies, even social media companies, like the kind of practices that users have come about, little habits, like on Twitter, the hashtag and the @ sign. Those are things that Twitter users came up with first, and Twitter's like, I'm going to build this in here. So there is a funny element of labor that can be commodified by these platforms.
Part of the appeal of the early web, which you talk a lot about in the book, was anonymity. How did we get from there to Facebook and the culture of oversharing?
One thing that's very important to remember about the early internet is that anonymity was a little bit of an icebreaker too, because so many people would sign up for AOL or Comcast, or I'm sorry, CompuServe, and they wouldn't know other people in these services. So having that layer of protection, this username, no photos attached to it, the stakes of entering into a community were quite low. If you said something embarrassing, you could just, create a new identity. But it was that ephemeral quality of communications is something that I feel like a lot of people miss nowadays, because you did have elements of freedom to express yourself in ways that were unique to that time. But in the years that, over the years, you'd have the early social networks like Friendster and MySpace, which were about connecting with people you know, as well as meeting strangers from the internet, and very often including images of a person so that you could kind of connect an identity from offline and online. That is how people gradually move toward creating what I think of more as a representation, not a direct mirror image of a person, but creating a representation of yourself on the internet. And just over time, with Facebook in particular, because Facebook is a lot of the communities are rooted in in-person communities, such as school board meetings or church groups or various kind of social alumni and civic kind of organizations, people having face-to-face meetings. A lot of people have since moved toward pretty accurate representations. Like, you can get a very solid sense of what someone might be like just looking at their profiles. But that has been the changes that took place over the course of 30 years. And I certainly think there's a lot that we miss by not having those elements of anonymity. I also think it's not, I have issues with some of the major tech companies, but I do think there are also a lot of benefits to being able to accurately represent yourself online.
Speaking of representing yourself online, once you do so, and then you choose to leave the internet, a lot of you will still be there. You mentioned that in your book. To me, that sounds kind of alarming. What do you mean by that? Yeah,
I think that is one of those trade-offs, and it's in the realm of aspects of the internet that I haven't resolved, and I feel like it's it shouldn't be the price of connecting, but it is something to be aware of, that if you are participating in various social networks or having an online identity at all, you are leaving data. The companies themselves can gather this data. It's data that might be incredibly personal, including if it's something like Flickr, where you've uploaded all of your wedding photos or photos of your children, things that are just priceless to an individual and not worth much to the company itself, except for the information that it in bulk, like that it could sell to advertisers, perhaps. It's an archive of a sort, and I don't think it's entirely I don't think it would be quite as much of a negative externality if there were more clear and concrete processes of organizing and sorting out the traces, like the digital traces that we leave.
Now, in the book, you talk about communities such as Reddit, etc., and you talk about the importance of mediation when it comes to internet communities to hold people accountable. Now, I totally agree, but it seems to me that the second you start holding people accountable, they start with a free speech argument and end up taking up a huge amount of your time, and it almost seems insurmountable and not really worth it. How does one go about maintaining decorum in these communities?
I mean, it's an ongoing struggle for one thing. I mean, if there's no, we have tactics, not solutions. We have tactics that we can use. Um, I, in the book, one of the people I interviewed, her name is Kat Lowe. She has a community of people, women involved in gaming, that have kept in touch over the years. And I was very surprised to learn that one of the outlets that they use to keep in touch is Reddit, because Reddit is a mix of some very hostile, but then some quite genuine communities. It's definitely a mix of that. But what they do is on Reddit, they think of Reddit as kind of the open door. It's a place that if you are a woman interested in gaming and you don't have people in your town who share this interest, or you're kind of alienated, you could possibly find this subreddit, and maybe the conversation that takes place in that subreddit is not quite as personal. It's maybe a little bit surface level, but what they do is they look at someone's posting history, and if they see that someone's been pretty active for the past 3 months, they haven't caused any problems, they'll get an invite to the Discord server, which is a little bit of a, the secret room. And it's not that this is a perfect method. It's not that people won't kind of sneak in and cause problems. And it's also not that, even people with the best intentions have arguments. This is just the nature of being a person. It's, but just having that little bit of a step removed so that you can't get overwhelmed with trolls. That's one method. I something that I think is pretty fascinating about this moment is how the labor of being a moderator is part of the internet experience, just by having an account in general. You can't kind of you can't pass it on to someone else, because if you were part of an internet community, if it is maybe a school community, it's possible you'll see people have a little tiff, and you can ignore it, or maybe you can just intervene and say, hey, why don't you take 5 minutes, or I don't know, just all the things that are right for that particular community. But it is something that's ongoing, especially now, where so much more of our lives than that anyone had ever imagined are now taking place digitally, whether through Nextdoor, on Zoom, on various digital platforms and services. And also a lot of people with their emotions running high in these services as well. It's just that experience of needing to intervene when things are touchy and tense like that. It's just it's just ordinary digital experience now.
Near the end of the book, you come to the conclusion that what the internet is aching for is librarians. As a librarian, I love that you said that. Thank you. And can you please explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Sure. I feel that goes back to the idea of this information that is constantly just being shed everywhere. And what do we do with it? What is the value of it? How should it be organized? Is this even information, or is it trash? I just don't see, I don't see any roles as of yet with in these companies, in our communities, to properly contextualize, and it's something that is a very, I feel like, I hope that this will get better theorized, but just this element of how even just participating, if you're participating through the internet, you are creating content, and that's not the same as writing a book. It's not the same as making a film, but it is content in the same way that There is content that is intentional. There's content that's that's not intentional. And I do feel that a better process around what is deciding what's valuable. Posts are sometimes very hard to remember too. I mean, it's not like if you have a bunch of text messages, it's not like those stay really firmly in your mind too. But yeah, so that's I feel like the respect for this as information. That's where I don't necessarily think there's a market solution. I think it's more processes that have yet to be developed.
So we need some people to get in there and sort of put it in order and make sense of it and make it classified in a way that a library is classified, so to speak.
Yeah. But particular for what information is. Yeah.
To change course real quickly, how long did it take you to write this book?
That's a bit of a tricky question because the actual writing was just a little over a year, but it's kind of like it's stories and things that I've followed for many years. So it's like the information in the book is over the course of 10 years. Actual writing of it was maybe a little bit over a year.
So how did you go about researching it, or did it sort of just happen? And did you know what you were looking for when you started this project?
Yeah, well, I think it was because in the early years of writing about the internet, there were very few outlets that I could place these stories. I think there was a real sense of what's the right way to talk about the internet. And I had a lot of resistance with editors just weren't sure how to tackle the internet, or maybe they didn't think it was enough there was enough cultural interest. So 10 years ago, you would see two basic kind of stories about the internet. There would be the business angle, which was not much more than this company has acquired this company is doing this, very strict kind of like, this is what they're doing, this is where they're going. And then the actual criticism in terms of cultural and social society, that would be about the internet as harmful just in totality. And there was a lot of that criticism would be about the users rather than the developers. And that is kind of where my book came to being, because I would get a little bit offended. I'd say, well, I'd read a story about how, everybody on Twitter is a dummy who takes photos of their breakfast and that's all they know. That's all they have to talk about. And I think, well, I had some interesting conversations on Twitter, and what's wrong with taking photos of breakfast? And meanwhile, there would be real problems with these services. There would be harassment, or there would be real frustrations, and it was very difficult to find an outlet to describe these experiences, because people were already inclined to think, well, the internet's just junk already, so of course bad stuff happens. And over time, over these past 10 years, there is much more of a sharper idea of the actual problems of the internet, which is break down as surveillance, break down as harassment, numerous kind of issues that come from the platforms themselves. But it was, I would say, before 2013, 2014, it was very rare to see people criticize the companies themselves. So that was kind of where I got started as a writer. And I was always really interested in it as culture too. And in my book, I cite a lot of artists actually, because I didn't see as many writers covering technology critically in those years. Like thinking back to like 2010, it was more artists doing this work. So I wanted to really weave in various like critical projects that were made at the time.
Okay, thank you so much, Joanne. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks again for taking the time. Once again, Joanne McNeil's book is called Lurking, How a Person Became a User, published by MCD Books. Please hop on the Greenwich Library website and go to our digital library to check out the ebook, or please give our friends at Diane's Books in Greenwich a call, and I'm sure they can send a copy right to your front door. And thanks for watching. And thank you again, Joanne.
Oh, thank you.